Did you know that you would be 10 times more likely to be murdered in medieval times? That's insane. But don't worry, I'm not talking about the dinner theater medieval times. They're still safe. You can keep eating your giant turkey legs and wearing your paper crowns. I'm talking about the actual medieval times, the period in world history after the Roman Empire and before the Renaissance. It was called the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, and it was a crazy time in the world for nearly 1,000 years. It wasn't all just knights fighting in jousts on horseback or monks writing copies of the Bible by candlelight. No, there was a lot of crime and murder. It gets worse. Do you know how they solved those murders? Spoiler alert, they mostly didn't. There weren't no police officers back then, so if someone got murdered, their killer usually just got away with it. But that doesn't mean someone wasn't punished. It was just the wrong person, usually. You know why? Because back then, people thought the dead body would tell you who killed it. I'm not kidding. That's what they thought. Today on Hammer's Law, we're heading back in time to find out what criminal justice was like in the year 700. Are you ready for CSI? Camelot? Let's dive in. There's something important to understand about the medieval times. Like I said, it was a violent time, 10 times as many homicides, but it was also an ignorant time. And I mean that literally. People who weren't rich couldn't read or write, and there was no public school. The only education was tutors for the rich or schools that were run by the church. So there wasn't much learning happening. It was called the Dark Ages for a good reason. And of course, they had no forensic science. There were some big breakthroughs happening in China, but Europe was decades behind. That meant most murders were either going unsolved or the wrong person was punished for them. Here's an interesting fact. Most people think that serial killers started in the late 1800s, but based on the number of murders in the Middle Ages, it's possible that serial killers have been around for a very long time. And it wasn't until our criminal justice system improved that we became aware of them. That's a crazy thought. Speaking of crazy thoughts, let's get back to why people thought dead bodies could identify their killers. The world was a mostly uneducated place, and many people had wrong beliefs that came from misunderstanding religion. Because of that, there was a lot of dangerous and deadly ideas to try and find someone's killer. One of those ideas was that they thought the soul stayed with the body even after a person was dead. Because of that, it made one person's job much more difficult. Guess who that was? That's right. The coroner. In modern times, we know a coroner's job is to do an autopsy to figure out what the cause of death is. But coroners had a hard time with that in the Middle Ages because of the belief that the soul hadn't left the body yet. There was no science to explain decomposition, so people at the time thought the body was decaying because the soul was slowly leaving. That meant coroners couldn't cut open a body while it was still fresh. They believed that it was still attached to the soul. Anyone who did that could be acting against God. And even if a coroner could perform an autopsy, they didn't really know what they were doing. In modern times, coroners go to college and sometimes even need to be certified and have a medical license. But the coroners of the Middle Ages were not even doctors. They might be able to find a cause of death for something clear and easy, but for anything difficult, they had to ask a real doctor. Can you imagine that? Another thing people believed back then was that the soul could still have physical influence on the body as well. They believed the body could identify its killer through something they called cruination. The idea was that if a killer touched the body of the person they killed, the blood would react to their presence. Another term for cruination is the ordeal of the beer. Here's how it worked. They would bring suspects to the body, which was laid out on its back, completely naked. The suspect was then told to walk around the body as many times, saying the victim's name out loud over and over. They were told to lightly touch the wounds that caused the death. If the body showed any activity, like bleeding or foaming at the mouth or movement, this was the soul identifying the killer. The suspect was then found guilty. It sounds crazy, but that's what they did. I mean, a body can't identify its killer, right? Well, here's the problem. Strange things can happen with a dead body. Sometimes gases build up inside a body, which can cause it to move or make noise. Bile and other liquids from within the body can also potentially come out of the mouth. And pressing on a wound can absolutely cause more blood to drip out of it. And you know what that means? Many people went to jail or were killed because a normal scientific reaction was considered a dead soul accusing its killer. Not only that, but think about how much contamination that caused. Having suspects suspects put their hands all over a body means fingerprints everywhere. It also destroys other potential evidence in and around the wounds. This was considered a good legal practice until nearly the 1700s. What a mess! If this sounds like the work of amateurs and not trained professionals, that's because most of it was. At the time, there was not much law enforcement. Aside from the coroner, it was basically just the sheriff, which was a position appointed by the king. The sheriff could recruit whoever it needed to form a posse and get his job done. But since there was only one sheriff, he wasn't patrolling to keep anyone safe or finding any of the bodies. That responsibility fell to the general public. Whoever found the body first was known as the first finder. Yes, it actually happened so frequently that they had an official name for it. What did it mean if you were the first finder? Well, you suddenly had a whole lot of responsibilities. If you found a dead body, your first job was to begin what they called the hue and cry. That basically means you scream your head off to let everyone know that somebody is dead. This was before the invention of the radio or telephone, so if you wanted people to know something, you had to yell. But your first responsibility as first finder didn't end there. Next, you were supposed to find suspects. The first finder would find and capture likely suspects to be put through crunation. If the suspects ran away, first finders were supposed to pursue them. If they resisted, the first finder was allowed to kill them. That's a lot of responsibility for someone who just stumbled across a body one night. Now we get to the most interesting part for a lawyer: standing trial. Once someone had been arrested on a suspicion of a crime, how did they handle the trial process in the Middle Ages? There were two primary ways, and both of them are pretty rough. The first way to defend yourself against accusations through compurgation. This means trial by oath. That meant in order to be found innocent, you needed people to testify to your innocence. How many people did you need to testify on your behalf? That depends on what you were accused of. The court required different numbers of testimonies depending on the crime. The numbers were extreme. If you were accused of poisoning someone, you had to find hundreds of people to swear to your innocence. Man, I can't imagine doing that today. Most people nowadays don't have several hundred contacts on their cell phone. Think about how much harder that was back in the Middle Ages when you barely had that many people in a whole village. It's possible that someone back then wouldn't meet 500 people in their entire lives. So if you weren't able to prove your innocence in a trial by oath, you could attempt a trial by ordeal, and it was quite an ordeal. You could choose fire or water as your trial. With fire, you had to carry a burning hot metal rod in your hands for 10 feet. Then, if your burn wounds healed within 3 days, you were innocent and set free. But if the wounds festered and got infected, they found you guilty. With the trial of water, they would throw you into a river. If you sink to the bottom, that was a sign of God accepting you, which meant you were innocent. But if you floated, that meant that the water and God were rejecting you and you were guilty. It's safe to say that odds were stacked against anyone being found innocent most of the time in the trial by ordeal. But don't worry, it wasn't all savagery and violence and nonsense. Slowly but surely, scientists and doctors made discoveries about forensic science. Important details came from observing the body. Things like establishing the time of death. For instance, time of death could be established by the presence or absence of rigor mortis. Rigor mortis is a level of stiffness that occurs in a body in the hours after a person has been killed. Once someone dies, it takes between 8 to 12 hours for the body to stiffen. It stays that way for about 18 hours, and then another 8 to 12 hours, the body goes limp again. Because of that process, investigators could establish the time of death based on a few things. Is the body warm or cold, and is the body stiff or limp? Those two pieces of information help them figure out when the murder happened. But the real change to law enforcement and criminal justice came with a man named Song-Si. He was a judge and a scientist in China in the 13th century. He has become recognized as the father of modern forensic science. Song-Si mastered the science of investigation through observing the human body. He gathered his most important discoveries in a book he wrote in 1247. The title is The Washing Away of Wrong: Collected Cases of Injustice Rectified. In it, he shared facts and stories about science that taught coroners to do their jobs better. I want to summarize one of the most amazing stories in the book. Song-Si was called in to solve the mystery of a man who was hacked to death by a sickle. They could tell it was a sickle because of the type of wound, but they didn't know who did it, and 10 villagers owned a sickle. Song-Si and others told the 10 men to bring their sickles to be examined. All the sickles were clean, with no clues to give away which was the murder weapon. Song-Si told the men to set their sickles down in front of them and leave them there. Then the whole town stood and waited for the hot sun for hours in the afternoon. Finally, flies began to gather one by one, and they all swarmed to a single blade. Song Si knew that the blade would be clean to the naked eye, but what couldn't be seen by people could be smelled by the insects. The owner of the sickle broke down and confessed to the crime when he saw the flies swarming on his sickle. That is how Song Si solved the sickle murder, and that is why we have modern forensic science. Thankfully, we've moved past the arcane criminal justice system of medieval times. Now, you go to jail because of DNA evidence and video proof instead of being accused by a bleeding corpse. Our modern system isn't perfect, but is a lot better than it used to be. I hope you enjoyed this trip into the legal world of the past. If you liked this video, I'll make another one about some other unbelievable legal systems in history. Maybe the Wild West. Thanks for watching Hammer's Law, and be sure to subscribe for more fun and informative legal content.